Teal dear, today we're going to do something rather interesting and a little bit different. We are going to be considering implicit bias. Now, you may have heard about this implicit bias and a certain implicit bias test, known as the Implicit Association test, or IAT, by Harvard University. And this test has been talked about quite a bit in the media, and I think it brings up something very relevant regarding issues that have been happening in July 2016, specifically claims of racism in the police force and the tragic police shootings that happened. The thing that I find most interesting about this implicit bias test is how the media reacts to it. So today, we're going to look at what this test actually is, the various criticisms and problems of it, how the media has reported on it, how the media is wrong in what they have reported, and how people will use one standard of evidence to justify a claim or statement, and then when that exact same standard of evidence is used to make a point that goes against their narrative, they will quite happily never address it. So let's get stuck right in there, shall we? There are several tests that you can take in this regarding gender, skin tone, weight, countries, age, sexuality, and race. And they all work in very much the same way. They'll start with a questionnaire in order to assess your conscious biases that you might have, whether or not you are quite open about any prejudices or biases that you might have, and then the test begins. The test is divided up into multiple segments. The first section is a series of photographs of people's faces, both white and black. You have to identify whether or not the picture is of a white person or a black person, and then click left or right appropriately. Phase 2 is very much the same, except with positive or negative words, clicking left or right appropriately. And then the final part of the first half of the test puts white people or black people with a category of bad or good, and then you sort them left or right appropriately. The second half of the test then takes this already established rule set and simply switches the sides around. So if you were previously sorting white people left and black people right, you will now be sorting black people left and white people right. Then you'll do the same thing with positive and negative words, and then the same thing with a combination of white-faced with a word and black-faced with a word. The hypothesis behind this test is the speed at which you recognize faces, first of all, is an indicator of whether or not you have any unconscious bias. In other words, if you recognize white faces faster than black faces, it might show you have a bias towards white people. If you recognize black people's faces quicker than whites, then that might show an implicit bias in favor of black people. The word segment is simply how quickly you react to a positive or a negative word. That phase is most important when you combine it with phase 3, which is the pictures of the faces. The third phase hypothetically measures how quickly you associate a positive word with either a white face or a black face, and a negative word with either a white face or a black face. And using some arcane formula that they never reveal to you, this is supposed to determine whether or not you have an implicit bias towards a certain racial group because you associate positive words quicker with one group than another, or negative words quicker with one group than another. So no doubt people are already seeing several potential pitfalls with this test. First of all, it is ultimately a test of your reaction time. On top of that, there's also a case to be made that because this study relies on reaction time, the fact that it flips the rule set halfway through can be seen as a handicap. Having spent the first 2 or 3 minutes of the test effectively developing a new form of muscle memory for, say, good left, bad right, you must now recondition your brain on the fly to go in the opposite direction from that original task. As a result of this, you have a test that could be measuring an implicit racial bias, when in reality no such bias exists. It's simply that your brain reacts slower to change than someone else's. There's also been some criticism that the test itself may in fact cause the bias that it then reports. For example, if the first face-word combination that you have is black with good and white with bad, some have suggested that that may cause a bias in the test taker's mind to associate black with good and white with bad, and that temporarily learned neural pathway for the sake of completing the test then carries over to round 2, thus affecting the outcome. Indeed, the outcomes from the test are so varied that even taking the test back to back, I myself received 3 different results. The first result suggested little to no automatic preference between white people and black people. The second result suggested slight automatic preference for white people compared to black people. And the third result suggested slight automatic preference for black people compared to white people. So clearly the repeatability of this test is slightly questionable, although given the largest swing that this thing was able to report was a slight preference for one over the other, and that preference went both ways, with the third result being right down the middle, it seems to me to be a fairly safe assumption that I don't actually hold any particular bias one way or another. So much for those claims of various detractors of mine who have attempted to slander me by calling me a racist. I accept your apologies. However, it might not be that simple. I personally do not put any particular stock in the validity of this test, and neither do several others. However, some people do, and we'll look at the rather interesting differences between these two camps later on, because there seems to be a rather interesting divide between them. But first, we're going to look at some of the criticisms of this test. Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman, writing in Psychology Today, has indicated that it's a well-known fact that people are prejudiced against outgroups, and that perhaps the IAT effect is just the result of the human capacity to associate positive stimuli more easily with an in-group and negative stimuli more easily with an out-group. In other words, perhaps the IAT is tapping into a more general quirk of human nature rather than a specific race effect. A few recent studies are consistent with this idea. In one study, researchers administered 2 different versions of the IAT. In one version, the in-group was French and me, and the out-group was North African. Using this version, they found an IAT effect. In another version, the 2 categories were French and North African and me. In this version, the effect completely disappeared. This suggests the crucial factor was an in-group out-group membership and not nationality. In another study by the same researchers, they established the association with either the in-group or out-group before administering the IAT, and found again that when people associated themselves with the out-group, there was no longer an IAT effect. In another study, a different team of researchers administered the IAT to 3 different groups of Americans, a Caucasian group, an African American group, and a Latino group. They found that the white-black IAT effect was largest for those in the Caucasian group and smallest for those in the African American group. Conversely, the white-Latino IAT effect was largest for the Caucasian group and smallest for the Latino group. For those in the Caucasian group, there was no difference in the white-black IAT effect and the white-Latino IAT effect. Again, these findings suggest that the relevant factor is in-group, out-group, not race. Finally, a Dutch team of researchers looked at the issue by replacing a racially charged outgroup name, Moroccan, with a racially neutral outgroup name, Finnish. And the author notes that they are making the assumption that the word in Amsterdam Finnish is racially neutral, whereas Moroccan is racially charged. When Dutch names were contrasted with either Moroccan or Finnish names, they found the IAT effect. More interestingly, when Moroccan names were contrasted with Finnish effects, no IAT was found. These results suggest that the racially charged Moroccan names were processed in a similar way to the racially neutral Finnish names. What factors influenced processing of the outgroups? For both of the in-group out-group comparisons, Dutch Finnish and Dutch Moroccan, they found that when positive concepts and the in-group Dutch names required the same button press, people required less time to encode and stimulate or to map their decisions onto the response keys, and were less cautious compared to when positive concepts and the out-group Finnish or Moroccan names required the same button press. The same effects weren't found in the Finnish-Moroccan comparison, where both were outgroups and therefore there was no in-group out-group comparison. The Dutch study ruled out potential explanations of these results such as name familiarity and the context in which the Moroccan category was presented. Instead, they prefer an explanation put forward by another group of researchers that it is more intuitive processing a positive word associated with an in-group than a positive word associated with an out-group. Processing a positive word with an out-group requires a switch in mental set in order to retrieve the correct category membership, and this takes up more time. Taken together, these studies suggest that the IAT effect is due to in-group out-group membership and not based on racial prejudice. all links to those studies available on the Psychology Today page. So it would appear that by manipulating certain variables regarding in-group and out-group preference, you can basically make the IAT give you whatever results it is that you want. Or indeed, you can simply completely reverse the results that you got only a few minutes prior. In fact, in some cases, you might not even have to take the test again. A paper published in the Journal of Applied Psychology, Strong Claims and Weak Evidence, reassessing the predictive validity of the IAT, makes this quite clear. We reanalyzed data from two influential studies, McConnell and Leibold 2001 and Ziggett and Haynes 2005, that explored links between implicit bias and discriminatory behavior, and that had been invoked to support strong claims about the predictive validity of the implicit association test. In both of these studies, the inclusion of race IAT scores in regression models reduced prediction errors by only tiny amounts, and the IAT scores did not permit prediction of individual-level behaviors. Furthermore, the results were not robust when the impact of rater reliability, statistical specifications, and/or outliers were taken into account. The reanalysis of McConnell and Leibold revealed a pattern of behavior consistent with a pro-black behavioral bias rather than the anti-black behavioral bias suggested in the original study. And this one is particularly interesting, so I'm just going to briefly read the important points about it. 90% of M&L's participants had positive IAT scores. The IAT is traditionally coded such that positive scores reflect relatively slower reaction times when African American stimuli are paired with positive words and/or when European American stimuli are paired with negative words. If 90% of respondents are biased against blacks and the IAT metric is not arbitrary, one would expect a large proportion of the sample to discriminate against the black experimenter. But that was not the case. In fact, over 70% of the sample acted more positively towards the black experimenter. This trend in the data was not apparent in M&L's reporting of results due to a data transformation and the reporting of results using only this transformed data. As noted above, M&L defined discrimination as the difference in molar ratings of interactions with the white versus the black experimenter. Thus, more positive scores would indicate more positive interactions with the white experimenter, and the sample mean difference score on the molar judgment variable should be positive. However, because M&L standardized the two separate molar ratings for each interaction, each separate molar rating had a mean of 0, and the mean of the summed molar rating approximated 0. Only by returning these two scores to their original metric and recomputing the molar difference score were we able to explore whether the white or black experimenter was perceived as receiving better treatment from the participants. We found that, on average, the judges assigned more favorable molar judgment ratings to the interactions with the black experimenter than that with the white experimenter, M3.8 versus M2.94 respectively. This difference was statistically significant. When one examines the untransformed data, it appears that those with high IAT scores were the least behaviorally biased in the sample. As IAT scores increased, the tendency to behave in a biased way against whites relative to blacks decreased. So it would seem in this particular study there was a little bit of statistical jiggery-pokery in order to get a certain result, which the original unmolested data did not support. Well, colour me surprised, because we've never seen that happen before in the social sciences. But what is interesting is how much stock people will still put in the results of an IAT test, with many people claiming that a connection between an IAT test and actual real-life discrimination exists. Indeed, this paper states it is this claimed connection between implicit attitudes and discrimination that can make IAT feedback particularly disturbing to test takers. It also is the feature that makes research on IAT of broad interdisciplinary interest. If the race IAT reliably predicts discriminatory behavior that cannot be consciously controlled, then society should take note. But as one example, the great majority of white Americans who have taken the IAT have been classified as anti-black. This then points to an epidemic, either of unconscious racism or of false positive accusation of unconscious racism. Given the importance of the link between IAT scores and behavior, one might expect to find a large body of data establishing this connection. Indeed, Greenwald and Krieger describe the evidence that implicit bias leads to discriminatory behavior as already substantial. In fact, only a handful of studies have examined the ability of IAT to predict behavior of any type, and just over a dozen published studies have examined the ability of race IAT to predict outcomes that might be indicative of inappropriate or discriminatory behaviors. Yet, the perception exists that the research between IAT scores and behavior have been much studied and well established. In this report, we closely scrutinize claims that the race IAT predicts discriminatory behavior and discover that the evidence is surprisingly weak, which shouldn't really surprise anyone given the study that we briefly looked at earlier, and this paper obviously looks at others besides. And what is interesting is that some people do seem to genuinely believe that the IAT is an accurate predictor of behavior. So, as I earlier promised, we're now going to look at the kinds of people who think the IAT is some predictor of actual behavior. And I think this is best done by simply reading some headlines that people have written about the IAT result mentioned in that paper, where the majority of white Americans who took the test scored with some sort of implicit bias in favor of white people. And it should be noted that the paper that all of these articles are referencing is this one, Pervasiveness and Correlates of Implicit Attitudes and Stereotypes. And the most relevant paragraph in this entire study is this. 3 different tasks investigated race ethnicity-related evaluations attitudes towards blacks versus whites, attitudes towards dark-skinned versus light-skinned individuals, and attitudes towards black children compared to white children. In all 3, responses were faster on the IAT when black or dark skin was paired with bad and white or light skin was paired with good compared to the reverse pairings. Approximately 68% of participants showed this pattern, while 14% showed the reverse. So this is one study which showed a 68% slight bias in favor of white people, using a method that is very questionable in its accuracy. Indeed, in some circumstances, you can even make the case that despite a high IAT score, people's attitudes and behavior will actually be the opposite, as outlined earlier. Now let's look at some of the headlines that this spawned. Across America, whites are biased, and they don't even know it, from the Washington Post. If you're white, science says you're probably a racist. Now what? From Quartz. Yes, all white people are racists. Now let's do something about it. From alternet.org. Well, that escalated quickly, didn't it? 68% of people showing a slight implicit bias using a dubious method that often doesn't actually align with how that person behaves. All white people are racist. Yep, that is the rational, logical, and reasonable conclusion from that evidence. This is the reaction that this study and others like it get in the media. And I'm sure you can now see the kinds of people who take the IAT very seriously. Generally the more left-leaning, progressive side of the political spectrum. But now I'm going to throw a little bit of a wrench in the works. You may remember at the start of this video I mentioned that I was going to link this to the claims of racism in the police force in the United States of America. July 2016 has been an especially interesting time and a very turbulent one around this particular political discussion, and is now a month that will be forever remembered for violent Black Lives Matters protests and gunmen murdering police officers over what they perceive as a systemic racial bias that the police force has against black people. And the progressive left-leaning media have of course ridden to the defense of the oppressed minorities. These people who will hear about an implicit bias test and take it as gospel that this is proof that all white people are racist, until they have to read this study from the Journal of Experimental Criminology, Results from experimental trials testing participants' responses to white, Hispanic, and black suspects in high-fidelity deadly force judgment and decision-making simulations. After developing and testing a novel set of 60 realistic high-definition video deadly force scenarios based on 30 years of official data on officer-involved shootings in the United States, 3 separate experiments were conducted testing police, civilian, and military responses to the scenarios in high-fidelity computerized training simulators. Participants' responses to white, black, and Hispanic suspects in potentially deadly situations were analyzed using a multi-level mixed method strategy. Key response variables were reaction time to shoot and shooting errors. Basically, they took a bunch of people, police, civilian, and military, and put them into a simulated environment. The participants are given a fake handgun, and a giant video screen is played in front of them, the size of a full wall in a room, depicting a situation which may or may not turn violent. And the participant then has to decide whether or not they are going to shoot the person on the screen or not, depending on how that person is behaving. It's a giant implicit bias test measuring people's willingness to shoot and the speed and accuracy in which they do so. Results: in all 3 experiments using a more externally valid research method than previous studies, we found that participants took longer to shoot black suspects than white or Hispanic suspects. In addition, where errors were made, participants across experiments were more likely to shoot unarmed white suspects than unarmed black or Hispanic suspects, and were more likely to fail to shoot armed black suspects than white or Hispanic suspects. In sum, this research found that participants displayed a significant bias favoring black suspects in their decision to shoot. The results of these 3 experiments challenge the results of less robust experimental designs and shed additional light on the broad issue of the role that status characteristics such as race and ethnicity play in the criminal justice system. Further research should explore the generalizability of these findings, determine whether bias favoring black suspects is a consequence of administrative measures, e.g. education, training, policies, and laws, and identify the cognitive processes that underlie this phenomenon. So, if you are one of those left-leaning progressive people who thinks an IAT score is definite proof of someone's actions, and that if you think an IAT score definitely proves that white people are racist, or at the very least prejudice against black people, then you must, by your own standard of evidence, now conclude that the police force is not racist against blacks, and that in fact police, civilians, and military are less likely to shoot a black person, even if they are armed, than a white or Hispanic person. I have yet to see any left-leaning progressive or social justice outlets talk about this study. Even the ones which used the previous study to somehow conclude that all white people are racist haven't touched it, but I'm honestly not surprised because narrative. And given the narrative that is being pushed that police are more likely to shoot black people because they are racist, it's very interesting to note some of the wording in this paper. Our findings may indicate a lack of implicit or subconscious racial bias connecting black suspects and dangerousness, perhaps indicative of a growing cultural awareness that blacks and crime are not synonymous. We, however, find this explanation unlikely. If blacks and crime were not related in the minds of our suspects, it would stand to reason that they would be treated in the same way as white and Hispanic suspects. This is not the case. If implicit racial bias is the explanation, it would appear that subjects feel black suspects are less dangerous than whites or Hispanics, that they are biased in favor of black suspects. Although possible, we feel that this is unlikely. We are currently investigating the neurophysiological responses of participants to see if they display more or less of a threat response to black suspects. If participants do display a greater threat response to black suspects, indicative of a subconscious association between black suspects and dangerousness, but still are more hesitant to shoot black suspects, it will provide further evidence that some conscious cognitive process is actively guarding against bias. we also plan on testing participants using both the implicit association test and our scenarios to investigate differences between implicit and behavioral bias. The results of this upcoming research will tell us whether subjects lack subconscious racial bias or whether something else is making them more hesitant to shoot black suspects. It is possible that the results may have no relevance to subconscious racial bias, but imply a behavioral counter-bias due to real-world concerns over discipline, liability, or public disapproval. This potential explanation has particular relevance for the study's police participants, for whom an administrative effect may influence decisions to shoot. Many law enforcement agencies have tightened their formal policies and increased cultural awareness training due to public pressure and awareness that the consequences of deadly force encounters tend to be graver when the subject in question is a member of a racial or ethnic minority. The law enforcement agencies from which our participants were sampled offer cultural awareness training, conduct in-depth evaluation of shooting incidences, and provide discipline for any misuse of force. Although an administrative effect may have influenced police participants, it could not have affected civilians who have not been exposed to police training, evaluation, or discipline. Given that civilians and police participants responded in similar ways, it is unlikely that an administrative effect is solely responsible for these results. Nonetheless, it is possible that moral concerns or societal pressures to guard against racism may have influenced participant responses, perhaps public concern over the treatment of racial and ethnic minority suspects and consequent pressures on the police to guard against biases are working. In other words, people are less likely to shoot black people because they know that there will be societal outrage if they do. It certainly seems to be a valid hypothesis. So let's wind this up and bring it to a close, shall we? Personally, I don't put very much stock in the validity of IAT testing, and neither do a lot of other people. Indeed, psychologists are still very heavily debating whether or not IAT is in any way indicative of any sort of behavioral pattern at all, especially since it seems that you can manipulate the data to have it tell you more or less whatever you want it to. And regarding people reporting on unconscious or subconscious bias test results, take it with a grain of salt. First of all, the results have quite possibly been tampered with. Secondly, even if the results haven't been tampered with, they might not actually indicate in any way what that person actually thinks. And third, the reporting on it is probably going to be biased as hell, with whatever news outlet you're getting your story from picking and choosing when that standard of evidence is allowed to be used, and then just completely ignoring anything which has the same measurement but proves something that they might not like. So, given everything that we've learned thus far, that study showing that the police force isn't racist isn't really evidence in and of itself, in the same way that those studies proving that the majority of white people are racist is not evidence of that in and of itself either. The study and use of implicit association testing is very much in its infancy. We don't know how useful or how accurate the results are going to be, or if those results are going to be in any way indicative of any other sort of behavioral pattern at all. Maybe in years to come the tests will be refined and will actually be able to be used for something, or it might just fall by the wayside as some useless piece of pseudoscience. For now, if you do wish to drink in the findings of IAT tests, do so with a very large chaser of skepticism.